Brilliant. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I've done a couple of webinars for IRSM and a conference presentation a few years ago. So it's great to be back and to talk about some of our work on resilience. As was mentioned, my name's David Denyer. I'm professor in the School of Management at Cranfield, but I also run the Resilience Institute across Cranfield University, which is a multidisciplinary group of academics and external partners who look at various aspects of resilience, from everything from kind of operational resilience within financial services, through to supply chain resilience, through to cybersecurity, defense, right through to kind of ecological views of resilience, the full spectrum of different disciplines that look at resilience. And we actually created that Resilience Institute back in 2019, where we realized that some themes that cut across all of our different schools were really addressing some of the really big challenges of our day, some of these really big external challenges that are facing organizations and governments and whole of societies, and risk and resilience being one of them. That was kind of just pre the COVID outbreak, and obviously resilience has been on the agenda hugely ever since. And I will talk a little bit about COVID, I guess, through the presentation. But the COVID pandemic is not going to be the only disruption that we all face. It was obviously a huge system-wide disruption, but thinking into the future, we're going to move into a period where we've got increasing levels of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. I guess you're familiar with this term, a VUCA world, and the notion of actually a period of perhaps permacrisis that we're moving into. And when you look ahead at things like climate change, and the implications that will have, then looking at the resilience of organizations, looking at the resilience of sectors, looking at the resilience of whole of society is going to be an increasing challenge moving forward. So we think it's a really big issue, and I just want to share a little bit of the thinking around that with you today, but with a particular focus on organizational resilience. So what I'm going to do in the presentation is talk about an approach that we've developed, a model that we've developed, and some thinking that we've done on organizational resilience. The piece of work that this is based on is a project that we did about a year ago with the National Preparedness Commission and Deloitte as partners. And was published and is freely available, and I'll give you a link to the report at the end, which you might want to look at, and also to kind of connect with me at the end. And if there's any other further questions that happen after this webinar, then you can contact me. And I always think these webinars are a great way to start a conversation. They're not kind of a conversation in themselves. If there are any questions that come up in the webinar, please do type them. I'll probably talk for about 35-40 minutes, and then I'll pick up questions. So hopefully you can kind of type into the chat or into the questions area whatever questions that you have, and I'll pick those up at the end. And it's often better to kind of respond to people's questions than me just being full on broadcast mode, because I could talk about this for days, but we've only got an hour. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen, and hopefully this will work, and let me know if it doesn't. So I think, yeah, I can kind of see that. I'll just go into full screen mode. Okay, so I'm going to present basically around one core model that came out of this work. The work that we did was firstly a piece of kind of literature work looking at the research evidence on organizational resilience, and that included about 180 studies on resilience. But then we looked at about 50 organizations that appear to have a kind of higher level of maturity in terms of their organizational resilience, and those were a cross-sector sample of organizations, everything from big high-tech organizations through to kind of critical national infrastructure, through to public sector organizations. And what I want to do is kind of share one of the core models in that approach, in that piece of research, but also maybe get you to think a little bit about the cultural change that we might need to build more resilient organizations of the future. Obviously, resilience is about systems and about processes and about assets and about infrastructure and supply chains and all of that kind of more structural stuff. But there's actually a really core behavioral and cultural and leadership element to resilience as well. And that really has come through strongly in our research. So I want to talk about everyone's part in organizational resilience. I want to give this one model that we've used as a scalable model that we've applied to individual processes, to projects, to whole organizations or departments, to even whole sectors, or as the government kind of wants us to do with its resilience framework that was published in December, just before Christmas, to think about resilience in a whole of society way. So how do we build a more resilient society? And I think that this approach raises some questions about where you kind of allocate your own time, where your focus is, where your resources are, and within your own organizations, what is the kind of cultural profile and what do leaders spend their time doing, and what are the implications for that as we move into this more disruptive perma-crisis kind of world of the future? And have we got that resilience that means that we're going to be fit for the future? Or are we actually building some organizations that are kind of more brittle or more fragile for the changes that lay ahead? So that's kind of where I'm going to go with the presentation. There's obviously a lot more to the work that I'm going to present in a 1-hour presentation. And like I said, you can get a copy of the report at the end. First of all, what I want to do is just get you to and again, it's not alive and I can't hear from you, but just want you to think about, if I say the word resilience, and I guess most of the people here on listening are from a world of kind of risk and safety and maybe business continuity and that world. So when I say resilience, what words actually come to mind? You know, if you just sit back for a second and go, okay, resilience, what does that actually mean? And what words, if I was to say, right, I want you to be a human thesaurus for the day and just come up with a list of words. And if we were having a live session and a live workshop that I do with many organizations around this, I always start with this, like, what does resilience actually mean for you? And so I'm just going to give you that just for a second, just 1 minute. I'm just going to get you to think and just think what words immediately spring to mind when I say resilience. And what that will do is just give me a second. Oh, I had some props here earlier. I think one of my colleagues has taken note. I've got a set here. That's good. So just take a few seconds, think about what does resilience really mean, okay? And if you apply it to even an individual, a team, an organization, a sector, okay? So hopefully you've kind of thought of at least a few words, or we've got a few words that just kind of bubbling up, coming to mind. I think when I say resilience to a group, generally, groups come back with 4 key kind of buckets or clusters of words. And I wonder if you've got the same ones. You can maybe put in the chat if you've got a different set or you've got words that don't fit into these kind of clusters. But the first set of words that come back from groups generally are that you create resilience, or resilience means it's kind of about robustness, it's about persistence, it's about stability, it's kind of dependability, reliable, consistent, you control stuff, you maybe have barriers to things, you defend against problems. So this is kind of like a resistance way of looking at resilience. So are we trying to build organizations that are resistant to future threats, okay? And therefore we can kind of organize to have that very resistant type of organization. But whenever I do this activity, people often will say, well, no, actually resilience is about responsiveness. And people will often use the kind of term bounce back. or it's the ability to recover from a problem. And some might say, well, it's actually about having kind of situational awareness, or the ability to sense situations and the ability to be able to respond really quickly to those kind of problems that we couldn't pre-plan for. So there's this responsive element to resilience. And you go, well, okay, is that all resilience? It's kind of like resist stuff and respond to stuff. But actually, if you think about this from an organizational perspective, both of those are quite defensive, i.e. we stop bad stuff happening or we respond to stuff. And what about actually being kind of more resilient for the future and thriving in adversity and trying to move the organization forward? So it's not just about protecting results, it's about achieving results. And I think in an organizational context, that leads us into thinking about a third way of looking at resilience, which is about the ability of the organization to realize its potential. So this is about optimization. It's about getting better and better at what we do. It's about increasing capacity. It's about getting more from less. It's about that high performance and progress and development and learning and continuous improvement. And if we're not doing that, if we're not realizing potential and we're not achieving competitive advantage, the organization will go out of business anyway if it's not delivering against the capacity it needs to deliver against. Or in a public sector organization, if it's not delivering to the public what that department needs it to deliver, then there's going to be problems for the organization. So this third element is often not brought into the debate around resilience, because often efficiency is being seen as kind of the antithesis of resilience. But I think it absolutely has to be in the conversation. Otherwise, we're not going to think about this aspect of resilience, and our organizations aren't going to be resilient. But that means that there's a fourth element to resilience, which is the ability of the organization to completely reinvent itself. That's not just the evolutionary change, it's the revolutionary change, it's the transformation of the organization. It's the ability of the organization to completely adapt and alter and create maybe a new business model or a new business venture, maybe a completely new product or service, or to really challenge some of its assumptions and say, why are we doing what we're doing? Maybe we should do something completely different in order to serve our end user, to serve our customer. So this means that this is a sort of fourth way of looking at resilience. And I think whenever I've done this exercise and said, right, think of some words, people generally have some aspects of all four of these elements in them. So we end up with these kind of four views of resilience. And all the way through this, I've talked about resilience as being an ability. You know, an alternative view would be to think about resilience as an outcome of doing stuff, and kind of a measurable outcome. For me, resilience is more a capability of the organization to do these four things, okay? To resist problems, to respond to problems and issues, to realize potential, and to reinvent the system and adapt and innovate and change the system and transform. But you can start to see that these things are problematic and in tension. And this is where I think a lot of organizations go wrong in terms of their approach to resilience. And what it does is it creates a set of tensions, and I call this a strategic tensions model that's going to come up on a slide in a second. Because every organization, whether it's a public sector organization or a commercial organization or a non-for-profit organization, is constantly balancing these four tensions. So the bottom left tension is this ability to resist. So every organization has to assure compliance to a kind of prescriptive system of rules, regulations, and standards. Some sectors are more regulated than others, but in every sector, there's a set of standards, rules that must be complied with, either explicit rules or more social norms and expectations of that organization. So bottom left, when you're managing your teams or you're managing your organization, one set of resources are going into that bottom left, the assurance, the compliance box, okay? And I guess from people that are working in a safety risk kind of business continuity world, you know, we know that box. We're really good at that box, and that's what we've done a lot of work on in the last, you know, decade plus, is bringing that into the organizations and doing that really well. But then on the bottom right hand side, we've got the need to have individuals in our organizations and teams in our organizations that are able to respond really quickly to emergent problems. And so we've got the responsiveness, and we've got to pay attention to that and resource that and spend some of our time on that bottom right hand piece as well. And then top left, obviously we've got to meet productivity and efficiency goals. So we've got that need to realize. So we've got some of our attention, some of our people, some of our resources doing that productivity and efficiency stuff. And then unless we want to become obsolete in the next 5-10 years, we've got to keep pace with technology and business model and consumer trends. So we've got to pay some attention to that as well. And we're constantly forced into this kind of tug of war. And if you get your resources balanced, all of these people here are your resources, your team, and you've got them perfectly balanced inside the organization. But if you start to say, well, hold on, I'm really worried about the organization. I think we've got some potential to have a real catastrophe here, a real crisis. So what I'm going to do is move a bit of my resource from the right hand side, and I'm going to shore it all up in the bottom left. You move some of the people from top right to bottom left, and what happens is the whole of the tug of war just slowly starts moving away down into this bottom left hand corner. And if you do that slowly, what happens is you get this kind of blind drift in the organization, where people don't even notice that there's more bureaucracy, more red tape in the organization. And it's kind of stifling the organization, but it's a bit like the frog being warmed up in water. It doesn't jump out because we don't notice that slow and steady drift until we hit the crisis, and then we realize we haven't got the adaptive capability left in the organization to deal with that kind of problem because we've moved all of our resources to the left. The other way is that we moved all the resources too quickly. We moved loads of people from the right over to the left, and what happens is the whole thing just collapses. And that's what we do see in some organizations. So let me just talk a little bit more about this in terms of this model, in terms of kind of culture and capability and what we see. And I've got a little, hopefully you can still see me on the screen as well. What I might do is just stop sharing for a second. All right, there we go. Can you see me again? Okay, good, right. So our bottom left-hand box, the way that we build the organization in that bottom left-hand box, it tends to be around two things, okay? And I'm going to talk about this in terms of all four boxes. There's a mindset element. What is the mindset that we have when we're in that bottom left-hand box? And what's the structure that we put in place in that left-hand box? And the same for the other boxes, but I'll start with the bottom left-hand box. So our mindset at the bottom of this model is that we're defensive, okay? So think about that in terms of a football match, okay? We're going to go and play Man City away at the Etihad, and what we're going to do is we're going to set up with a real defensive mindset. Yeah, we're going to play 5 people at the back and 2 holding midfielders, and our mindset is don't let them score, and a draw is going to be a good result, okay? So we're kind of going in with a very defensive mindset. Organizations that have a defensive mindset see problems or changes as threats, not as opportunities. It's about protecting results. You hear things in the organization, the language of maintaining the status quo. That's not have major issues. That's protect, that's prevent stuff from happening. Okay, let's secure things. Those are all kind of defensive language that you just hear in organizations. Okay, so that's the mindset. The other way is that we structure in a way to create consistency in the organization. So the bottom left-hand box is a bit like my little blocks of Lego here. So what we've got here is 4 blocks, and these are 4 building blocks of any organization. Just imagine, I haven't got them written on here, but maybe this one is the goals. So what we've done is set a clear, consistent, standardized set of KPIs for the organization. This one is systems and processes. So we've got our standard operating procedures, and we want everyone to comply, which is our third strand. So that's behaviors. So we've got goals, processes, behaviors, and we do a lot of compliance-based training because we want people to comply with those rules. And our final bit is values of the organization. And so many organizations now have gone into a standardization process around their values. So we must all have the same values, you know, honesty, integrity, respect. It's amazing how many organizations have those four, whether they do fried chicken or that they're a nuclear power station. But that's a side conversation. But basically what we do is kind of standardize goals, processes, behaviors, and values in the organization. So we got all the same color, people, homogenous, because we think consistency is the answer to resilience. And then we move into the top left-hand box, which I'll come back to and put on the screen again in a second. But just to illustrate it with my props, what we realize is that this is completely inefficient and it doesn't drive the right capacity of the organization. We need to get more from less out of this. So what we then do is move into the top right. And what we'll do is we'll just stretch the organization a little bit and we'll get a little bit more out of our organization. Okay, we've just now made it a bit bigger, we've got a bit more out of it, and it hasn't broken yet. So what we do is we'll stretch it a little bit more, and we get to this stage and we go, okay, now look, we've doubled up, we've got twice as much out of our existing resources we had before. And then we keep doing that because it still hasn't broken. And then you reach this point, you go, well, that's wonderful, and then a crisis comes along and the whole thing kind of falls apart because we've just stretched the system too much and we've driven out the resilience. So that leads us into kind of more of a view of resilience, bottom right, that's more like an elastic band here. Yeah. So we create this buffering capacity in the organization, or redundancy, which enables the organization to stretch. But then the idea here is that it kind of bounces back to the existing state. So you get the stretch, it stretches, and you've got this buffering going on. Okay, you've got this flexibility. Now the problem with this is that that's a great idea, and it's a great aspect of resilience, that bouncing back. But even this elastic band, if I keep continually stretch it, and I do that 10, 15, 20 times, maybe 100 times, this elastic band will eventually break. It will start to show signs of those stress. And if you ask your teams to continually bounce back and firefight problems, you're doing exactly what I'm doing to this elastic band. Stretching it, creating those tensions in the organization, and eventually this breaks and it's no longer able to bounce back. And then you reach the top right box, and I haven't got my prop in front of me, but imagine a piece of blue tack, top right. So the blue tack, you take it out of its wrapper, you can make anything you want with it, and you can morph it, transform it, change it. You can make a little paper, you can make a little blue tack person, a little blue tack aeroplane, whatever you want to do with that. It's completely morphable, it's transformable. But what you find really difficult to do is put it perfectly flat again, iron out all the creases and put it back in the packet. So this idea of bouncing back, actually, if you start to move into that top right box, you're never going back. It's always about bouncing forward. It's about transformation. And those for me are kind of four ways of thinking about these tensions. Now, if I go back to this model, so we've got bottom left, preventative control, resistance box, bottom right, people able to notice and respond to problems. Top left, performance optimization, and then top right, adaptive innovation. And I put in there some sort of little cultural items about bottom left is about following the rules, bottom right, bending the rules, top left, update and improve the rules, and top right is all about breaking the rules. And, you know, what rules, if we're really going to go into that innovation space. And you can start to see where this becomes a real issue for leaders in organizations, because on Monday morning, if you say to people, well, I really want you to just follow the rules and be compliant because we can't afford to have a problem, and I want you to control risk, And then on Tuesday morning, you're saying, well, actually, I really want you to be a creative problem solver. I need you to be able to improvise. And then on Wednesday morning, you're saying, well, I need you to improve and exploit and get more from less and drive some efficiencies through this organization. And then on Thursday morning, you're saying, well, I want you to completely re-innovate and think about how we might do things completely different. Just throw out the old rule book. Friday morning, they're sitting there going, what the hell do you want me to do? And maybe this isn't the job for me. And this is the problem with this, is that we don't sort of take a step back view and really think about what is the type of resilience that we are wanting to build into our organizations. And for me, we don't build a fit for purpose approach to resilience. So if you think about each one of these as 4 strategies, and they are very, very effective strategies, all 4 in the right circumstances. But if you want to have not what we've had in the news recently today about, you know, the UK wanting to increase its nuclear operation. Well, I've done quite a bit of work in the nuclear industry. I would actually like them to do a lot of that bottom left-hand box. I do not want them to operate the business in the top right-hand box as though they are Netflix or Google. Yet what we see in so many organizations is a kind of mismatch between these 4 approaches and the environment, their purpose, what they're trying to achieve. So let me just say a little bit more about this, because if we stretch these things too far, what we see in organizations is that we've got also 4 failure modes, and we've got 4 cultures or negative cultures that we see in organizations. So if we go too far into the bottom left, as an organization, the organizational outcome is that you create a completely stagnant organization. It's not commercially viable. It doesn't innovate. It doesn't improve, because it's a bit like that tortoise that has built a stronger and stronger and stronger shell around it. And when it sees a threat, it goes inside its shell, because we can put all of these controls around us, and we've got defenses in depth, and we feel really secure inside that shell. Which is absolutely fine as an approach to resilience if the threat is a cat. But if the threat is a lorry, you're absolutely stuffed. And kind of COVID was the lorry, not the cat, that we built the system against. And we've driven out all of the adaptive capability of the organization. The cultural problem of the bottom left, if you drive so far down bottom left, is that you can very easily end up with a blame culture in the organization. Top left, the organizational problem is if you optimize too much, you drive out any of the redundancy in the organization, you remove the slack, you remove the redundancy, and a bit like my little building blocks that have gone flying around the room here, you create a brittle organization. And the cultural aspect of this, if you're optimizing, is it can very easily lead into a bullying culture. Bottom right, the problem is defensive, flexible, people are bouncing back all the time. The problem is it's very fragmented, because you've got lots of people improvising and doing different things. And the cultural issue is that people get very easily burnt out in that, and you get this kind of crisis fatigue. And the top right is also problematic. If you do it too much, you can create some kind of complete disorder, because everyone's reinventing the wheel, everyone's innovating, and it's just bewildering to people, because we've just got that change fatigue and nobody really knows, there's no stability left in the organization. Top right is also problematic. A really good example would be Uber. So incredibly innovative, adaptive, creates the business model, doesn't respond to a disruption, it creates the disruption. But if you look at all the legal disputes it's had, accusations of tax evasion, accusations around workers' rights, the chief executive lost his job because of all the legal disputes, company was devalued and all that. You know, we pushed so far top right without so much of the bottom left. So the key thing here is that profile shape. It's not that we now pigeonhole any organization into one of those 4 boxes. We say that there's probably a right cultural shape for the organization. But it's when that cultural shape crosses one of those thresholds or is completely out of shape with the needs of the environment. And one of the things that we've found with this, because we've obviously doing research around this, and we've got a survey tool that we use with organizations, and when we survey the top team and when we survey other people inside the organization, there is very often a huge gulf between what the senior leaders think the organization profile is and what it needs to be, and where everyone else in the organization thinks it is and where it needs to be. So it really does get us into some really interesting conversations about the views of senior leaders versus the rest of the organization. Just a few images to kind of illustrate some of these points, and as I said, I'll come back to some questions on this. I'm sure there will be some, but I think these images really illustrate those four cultures. So the bottom left is the organization, and maybe you think about your own leadership role and think about which of these cultures do you kind of create as a leader, and where do you spend your time. If I said to you, if you think about over the last 3-4 months, you've got 100% of your time, what would be the percentages that you've spent in each 4 of these boxes? And this is one of the things that we see with leaders all the time as well, is that they say, well, actually, we're bottom left, but we need to be much more top right and a bit more bottom right, but we definitely want to be moving top right. And you say, okay, how much of your time have you spent in each of these boxes? And all of those senior leaders spend their time on the left-hand side of this model, the majority of their time. You go, okay, so who is actually going to do the innovation and who is doing the mindful action and the responsiveness stuff? So particularly the top right is the one that senior leaders spend far less time on, but it's where all of those senior leaders say they want to go. Back to the cultural bit, and I like these kind of analogies for this. Preventative control is like the leader being the person with the belay in a rock climbing pair. Someone's wanting to scale and take some risk and innovate and do something new, push the frontiers, and you've got this leader that's holding on to the rope, and the leader's saying, well, all along the way as you're climbing, I want you to put the protective equipment in place so we can be sure that we're not going to have a problem. So they're putting this protective equipment in place. This leader's holding on to that rope, and sometimes it's a really short rope because we don't really want to let them go too far. And I think that's a really nice analogy for the role of not only leader, but maybe someone in a safety department or in a risk department or in a compliance department, where actually if you get this right, you can hold that rope in a really good tension where you give out some slack, but not too much slack, because if you give out too much slack, the person falls off the rock face, pulls out all the protective equipment and hurts themselves. But if you don't give out any slack, you can't move forward. But if you get this right, you can allow enough slack out for the person then to secure themselves maybe on a ledge, allow you to come up, and then they can go again. And that's how you climb a really big mountain as a pair. But so often we're holding that rope tight. Yeah. Bottom right for me is more like the jazz. And you've got different parts of the organization. You maybe have a client problem, or you just face some kind of issue that you've not seen before, and you're saying to a team, right, fix that problem. And you've got one department, someone starts playing the guitar, and you've then got someone else that gets the saxophone. And in most organizations, they really struggle to play together, and it sounds awful. And when they look around, there's nobody else in the bloody room either, because no one's joined their jazz band. When this works really well, you've got these people that can come together, and someone can kick off a tune and the others can pick up on the cadence of that and work really effectively. So, you know, positives and negatives of both, of all of these. Top left is like the classic high performance sport, is where we are trying to get that notion of that Sir Dave Brailsford called the aggregation of marginal gains, which was, let's not try and make 100% improvement. Let's make 1% improvements in everything we do. We're just going to fine tune it, improve it, improve it, improve it, improve it. But as I mentioned earlier, the real danger in those real high performance environments and high pressured environments where people are really driven by KPIs and measures is that it can very easily slip into a bullying culture. And then top right, I love this idea of the adaptive innovation is like that trapeze. And what you're saying to your team is that I need you to let go of the past. I need you to think about the future. I need you to have the psychological safety to let go. And you as a leader also need the psychological safety to let go and allow them to go up there and to take that risk. And when you've got novices, as an analogy, you probably, as a leader, you put the safety net under it. But actually, when you've got your high performing team and you've got your people who are real experts and more expert than you, there's no safety net there. You just have to let them go and do it like you would in a circus. You wouldn't have the safety net there anymore. And that is a really difficult thing, I think, for leaders to do, especially the ones that are holding on to this rope. So hopefully that helps you think about cultures. The last thing I want to do, and I know we've got like 20 minutes left, so this is perfect. So I'll just spend 5 minutes on this, 15 for questions. What really does this cultural shift mean? And I've been working with a few organizations. I'm working with one bank at the moment. I've been working with construction organizations and public sector departments. And it's quite clear that there's a lot of consistency across those organizations in some of the shifts that they're trying to make in terms of kind of culture for resilience. And I'll just go through these and see if these resonate with you. And again, you know, very happy for you to ask questions about this or comment on the relevance of this to you. But I think the first thing at the top, I think the first thing we've got to recognize is most of our organizations are actually quite high functioning, quite stable in operation. We've created systems that deal with the majority of problems. And sometimes we kind of forget that, and we get this kind of feeling like we've got to do this massive resilience project or program to be fit for the future. And we kind of forget that what we're actually pretty good at anyway. And I always think any kind of cultural change builds on what you're already good at. And I think it's important to say that. These organizations that I'm working with, all of them share a real commitment to resilience. You know, they recognize that there's going to be disruptions. They all believe that kind of future failure is probably inevitable. However good you are at planning for stuff, you will always get problems in the future. And they're all committed to regulatory compliance. They're all inspected. They will all have real issues if they don't conform to regulatory rules and procedures. So those kind of things that have to be there. And they are in all of these organizations, but some of the big shifts, okay? So what I'm arguing is that it's not a shift by saying, right, what we're going to do is we're going to jump to the right-hand side of that model and forget the left. It's actually the left side of that model, performance optimization and preventative control actually gives you the confidence to do mindful action and do adaptive innovation. So it's a both and argument. So to our consistency and standardization, what we need to be thinking about is how do we build that flexibility and diversity into the organization. And so rather than maybe recruiting people that look like ourselves or look like anyone else in the organization, we actually start to need to look at the diversity of thought that we're bringing into the organization. When we're looking at processes, maybe it's not just thinking about how do we make them more consistent, it's actually saying, well, what are the ways in which this could be more flexible? A big shift that I see is that many organizations do a lot of work around risk management and material risk types that the organization might face. The more resilient ones that move more towards the right-hand side also think about resilience in a more risk agnostic way. And what I mean by that is that, say I work in a university and we might have a real operational disruption by having a power cut. We might have a water supply issue. We might have a chemical leak. We've got an airport here. There could be kind of an air crash, or there could be a terrorist incident. Okay, and we might run a scenario for every one of those and think about how those might affect us. Or we could think about how resilient is our operation, and regardless of which of those might materialize, can we actually continue to deliver the essential services that our organization needs to deliver to our end user this time, next time, anytime, regardless of the risks and which risks might materialize. And this is very much the way that the banking sector has gone. Financial services, with the three regulators, Bank of England, PRA, FCA, is basically saying that we want you to talk about your essential outcomes, your delivery of those outcomes, regardless of what risks might materialize. That also leads us into a next shift, which is not just thinking about how do we recover our assets or processes. So if you're a water company, it's not just about how do we get our treatment plant up and running again if there's a problem, into thinking about how do we recover the outcomes to the end user. So if the outcome is delivery of drinkable water as a water company, regardless of whether or not we can recover the asset, what we can do is recover the outcome and think about alternate ways in which we can deliver that drinkable water to our end user, particularly vulnerable end users. So a shift from just assets and processes to really thinking about resilience of outcomes. Another shift that we see is that many organizations will have process maps, which are basically maps of how people imagine that process operates. They very rarely go in and look at actually how those processes are undertaken and how things are achieved at handovers and how things are communicated and how work is actually done in the organization. And I think when organizations on the right side here start to do that, they start to really see some of the vulnerabilities and the critical steps and the things that might make them vulnerable for the future. Another shift that we see is kind of building on a risk appetite conversation, which is usually about our ability to deliver our business objectives, is to an impact threshold conversation about the impact on the end user and on those outcomes. So if the water company can no longer deliver drinkable water to a community, what is an acceptable level of impact? Or at what level is there a cause for concern? At what level do we action an emergency response to that? And we do start distributing bottled water. The more resilient organizations have the conversations about those impact thresholds before the disaster happens. The others are kind of, I guess, self-explanatory. Not just a conversation about current risks that I see in so many organizations, but actually what are the future trends and how might those future trends be combined with the current risks to actually create real emergent risks for the future. Organizations still not really thinking in that way. Moving beyond human error and compliance to how do we build on the human contribution and build psychological safety in organizations, I've already mentioned. I think there's a real issue that we have around this whole field, is that we often will inform people about our risk and resilient requirements rather than actively involving people across the organization in improvements that lead to more resilience. The next one might need a little bit of explaining, because I think we actually do more of the bit on the right, which is the only one of these where we actually do the stuff on the right, which is what we'll do is we'll run the kind of hurricane scenario or the terrorist incident scenario, and we kind of test our response capability. The bit that we don't do is actually the bit more on the left, which is once we've talked about our essential outcomes and we've mapped those outcomes, is stress testing the requirements that we have for delivering those outcomes. So very few organizations kind of create a blueprint of those services that they're delivering and then tweak the parameters, like what if this person can no longer come to work, and what if this process doesn't work, or this bit of IT no longer works, and you just ramp up the requirements until you break your own system. Very few organizations do that, and the ones that I have done this kind of stress testing with, I've got multidisciplinary teams to effectively come together in the morning. I get them to write a newspaper headline about the disaster that's just happened in the organization, and then spend the rest of the day getting them to break their own system. And it is amazing how creative people can be in breaking their own organization and their own system. And for me, we don't do that enough in organizations. And the last one, which you probably will be familiar with, is that there's a real danger that we park this stuff in a specialist department, the risk department, the safety department, the compliance department. Now we've got directors of resilience, heads of organizational resilience in organizations, which is all great, and it raises the profile and it shows some investment in this area. But what all too often happens is that then the whole resilience effort of the organization is deferred to that person. And the more resilient organizations are the ones where resilience is everybody's responsibility across the organization. And those specialists are facilitators and coaches that help embed that into the organization. They're not the technical specialists that everyone relies on and thinks are the people doing resilience for us in the organization. So I'm going to stop pretty much there, apart from to say this is my QR code to my LinkedIn and a web address there for my LinkedIn. At the bottom left is the Resilience Reimagined report, where there's a lot more about this. It is freely available, and if you go to my LinkedIn, there's a link to it from there, so you can get that free from there. So I'll just leave that on the screen while we just go back and we'll look at what questions you have, and I've got 12 minutes to answer them.
Thanks ever so much, David. It's really, really informative. So we have got some questions. The first one is about being a risk agnostic. You can't plan for everything, but you can plan for anything. And is this the evolution in thinking from business continuity planning to business resilience planning?
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't. So yes, two things. Okay, so yes, it is the evolution in thinking. But I really don't like this kind of, it's very easy to end up in a bit of turf wars between like business continuity professionals and safety professionals and risk professionals and resilience professionals, when actually we're all often talking about exactly the same thing. So I'm not sure it's kind of evolution of business continuity, because I think the business continuity world has made big advances and is moving in that direction as well. But I think it is the evolution in thinking. And I think the problem with single risk thinking is that we can map on our risk register all of the things that we think are going to be high probability, high consequence, and identify all of those and put in place things for those things to happen. But most organizations are affected by things that aren't necessarily on their risk registers, or they're affected by a subtle combination of a multitude of those factors that might not actually be high consequence or high probability. Is often the coming together of lots of the kind of low consequence, low individual impact stuff that actually builds to be a much more significant impact. So I think this idea of risk agnostic is saying, like, don't just think about individual risks, but how intrinsically resilient is our organization, regardless of what is going to be thrown at it, because we just can't predict what is going to be thrown at it.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And you picked up something, you mentioned something then about sort of individual impact. And so somebody's asked a question is whether the resilience of individuals within an organisation actually has an impact on the resilience of the organisation as a whole. And if it does, how does the organisation help that individual to be more resilient?
Yeah, brilliant question. And again, not a simple answer. So I 100% agree with the comment that individual resilience is aligned with and contributes to organizational resilience, just as organizational resilience will affect individual resilience. Okay. I don't subscribe to organizational resilience is the sum of individual resilience. And my thought about types of kind of resilience at an individual level, if you think about the 4 boxes, they actually require very different approaches at an individual level. So the bottom left box might actually suit someone that is kind of risk averse, actually really doesn't want to take the risk, is really compliance oriented. Top right is going to take someone that's complete opposite of that, that's a real risk taker and innovate. Now they're all contributing to resilience. And for me, kind of individual resilience is like, what's our own individual contribution? And it's not that we want organizations that all look the same like my Lego blocks. And I think that's the real danger. It's actually embracing that diversity, because one of the biggest factors that contributes to organizational resilience is diversity of thought in the organization. If we don't have diversity of thinking, we often can't imagine the disaster that's going to affect us, and we can't create the solution to that problem. And for me, innovation is always the exit strategy out of a crisis, and it all leads from that kind of diversity of thinking, diversity of thought.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Next question is, how do we as risk professionals help our leaders make that cultural shift that you mentioned? What impact and what part can we play?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and again, probably multiple parts, and we could probably talk about that all day long. I think I don't see the risk professionals being only pigeonholed into that bottom left-hand box. You know, I actually see them as facilitating the conversation about the resilience of the organization. But the bits that are in the bottom left-hand box, I really like that idea of the person doing the belaying holding the organization in a kind of productive tension, not in a restrictive tension. And if you can do that, then the organization can actually go up the mountain, like I say, in a very safe way. And I think that for me is one way to think about it. But I also think that as a whole field, we've got to shift the kind of mindset or the thinking of the risk professional or the safety professional or the kind of resilience professional, business continuity. We're all in the same kind of field. To stop thinking about that as a specialist technical department to actually a strategic enabler of the organization, and to start having the conversations about being fit for the future and strategies for the future. And as soon as you start talking the more progressive agenda, which I think is a real contribution that resilience does over some of those other disciplines, it has that more progressive view, then actually you can start to engage senior leadership teams in seeing resilience as the enabler for some of those things for the future. Okay,
thank you. We've got a couple of very sort of practical questions now. So how do we make sure our organisations are adequately prepared for different events, for disruptive events? And then how frequently should they be testing their capabilities, in your opinion?
Yeah, so, okay, really good one. So again, I wouldn't be saying don't do any of those things that we see as really good practice in risk management, business continuity management, disaster recovery, crisis management, all of those things, okay? What we're talking about is the add to part. The bit that we wrote about in Resilience Reimagined has 4 key things, which was really be clear about your essential outcomes as an organization, those things that you're delivering to the end user, that if you don't deliver them to the end user, the member of the public, the customer, that's going to create some form of harm. So the first thing is being really clear about essential outcomes. It's amazing how many organizations can't tell you what they think their essential outcomes are, or the senior team don't agree. I work with one bank at the moment, and we've identified 32 essential services that bank provides, just to give people a view of, you know, it's not an infinite list. You don't have 500 and you don't have one. You know, any one of those is going to cause some form of harm if it doesn't work. The next thing is to really think about impact thresholds. So at what point will it cause harm? At what point is there a cause for concern? What harm will it do? What's kind of acceptable, tolerable, normal, and what would be constituted as a real issue, and what would be a disaster around that? That leads to some great conversations. And the third thing is that you map it end to end, surface to core, to really understand it. It's not just work as imagined, it's actually how it happens, particularly if you've got services that cut across different silos in the organization. How do you get those handovers? How do you get the documentation right? Where's the critical steps in that? And the fourth bit is the stress testing. And it's not just stress testing by saying, right, now let's do the kind of terrorist incident scenario or the powers off scenario. It's once you've got your blueprint, it's trying to break the blueprint of the organization. And that's where you really see how resilient that service delivery is. And that should be an ongoing process. Certainly once we've mapped it, we go straight into a testing. And then almost every day is a testing of the resilience of that blueprint, because every day it's being tested by something. So it goes into a kind of ongoing process once you get into that stage. But those 4 things, if I was to say, how do you add to what we already do those 4 things and read about it in that report.
Okay, thank you very much. Just checking to see if we've got any more questions. I don't think we have at the moment, so I think we'll leave it there. So thank you ever so much, David, for sharing your knowledge with us today. And if we can, I'll direct people to your LinkedIn page as well afterwards, so they can get a sight of that report. I've read the report and it is really, really interesting. So yeah, it's good for people to see that. Thank you for everybody that's joined us today. I'll put the recording of the webinar up onto the IIRSM Resource Hub later on, so you'll be able to catch up or recap on anything in your own time. So we'll end the webinar there. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you again, David, and we look forward to seeing you again at another IIRSM webinar in the near future. Thanks, Em. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.